So my name is Brene and I work with Northwatch, and we're a coalition of groups in northeastern Ontario. And we've been working on this issue since our formation in the late 1980s. But we have throughout that time worked with groups in the Northwest on two things: on nuclear waste burial schemes and on electricity planning. And those two things are rather locked. So do I need to put this on? Okay. I'm going to attempt. So I'm going to try to move at a fairly good pace because we really do want to have time for conversation and your questions after we finish. So what I'm going to do is talk about specifically about radiation risk and accidents related to nuclear waste transportation. And I'm showing you some documents. This is just to give you a sense of what we've looked at to prepare for this conversation and what we've been looking at over the years. And there are lots of documents produced by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization that are available. Unfortunately, there are also documents produced by the Nuclear Waste Management Organization that they refuse to make available. And Vince Ponca from NWMO is in the back, and I just got an email from him a couple of days ago telling me that of the 6 reports I requested most recently, only 2 are available. So what we're referring to are those documents that are available through the NWMO, although we have accessed information through the Federal Access to Information Act as well. So this is the background, this is the context, these are the information sources we've drawn upon to understand what the NWMO is proposing. So Dodie has, I'm just going to skip quickly through this because Dodie has covered some of this material. So they are proposing to construct a deep geological repository, a deep burial facility between Ignis and Dryden to transport all of Canada's high-level radioactive waste over a 50-year plus period. Dodie's right, it started at 40, now it's up to 50. The industry is proposing to continue to design and construct additional reactors, so that 50 years could go longer. But to transport the waste, the high-level waste, to this centralized selected site, to process the waste. There's a whole other conversation we could be having and need to have about the risks associated with what we're calling processing, what the NWMO calls packaging, which sounds a lot friendlier than I think it will be. But the waste will be opened, put into different containers, then moved underground. Then at some point that repository will be closed and the NWMO will at some point walk away. That's what we call abandonment. And we think that that is a reckless approach to radioactive waste, long-term radioactive waste management. So in these documents that we've reviewed by the NWMO, there was one back in 2014. The NWMO, when they're talking about transportation, generally don't talk about radiation risk. They generally don't talk about radioactive exposures, what is the radiation that can and will be emanating from these packages as they move through our communities. They generally don't, but they have in a short list of documents. And the first one was this document in 2014, which was looking at, it was a generic transportation worker dose assessment. And they've had a series of documents since then which are similar and which by my current assessment seem to rely on the same starting point kind of calculations and assessments. So what we did is we looked at them, at this document, just to look at what are the assumptions. So in the end, when the NWMO makes their pitch to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, most of what they call their safety case will be based on predictions, on computer models. And when they're looking at transportation dose, their dose assessments are based on their calculations. And one of the challenges for us as members of the public is that we don't have access to the actual data, and we don't have the technical experts to help us unpack and unbundle that data and really test out is this a sound conclusion? Is this something we can rely on? So what we did do is we looked at some of the basic assumptions. So they made some assumptions about how long it's been out of the reactor. So the fuel goes into wet storage for 10 years and then dry storage for 30. But in some of the NWMO's more recent documents, they are actually letting slip in this notion that the waste might not be kept at the reactor station for as long. They've introduced this possibility. So that assumption of the fuel being out of the reactor for 30 years maybe isn't a sound assumption. Then there's assumptions around the number of trips per year that the driver would be exposed to, what the dose would be, what the conditions would be, how hot the fuel would be. Sorry, you want to do something else?
Yeah, sorry, I just don't want you to step on it, that's all.
Okay. He already told me I stepped on my pointer. That's why we don't have that. So he doesn't want me to step on his mic box. So they assume the driver will be 8 meters away, the assumptions around the number of hours, the length of stops, and so on. All these assumptions. But then if we check the assumption, and this is doing a really, really simple,
My father had a saying, figures don't lie, but liars figure. That seems so good.
I'm going to try to remember that. So just if we start just checking some of the basic assumptions, that the design of, maybe they're 6 meters away instead of 8 meters away. Maybe it's a slightly higher burn-up fuel. Then those dose calculations start to change. And if we make an assumption that, the NWO makes an assumption that the driver will do 40 hours a week. I don't know any truckers who do 40 hours a week. A 44-hour week would result in more trips, 60-hour week, 125 trips. And that one simple changed factor produces a 50% increase in dose. So, and all that's to say, and I can't say, I'm not a technical expert. I can't say, that number the NWMO gave is wrong. But I can say, I don't have confidence in the number the NWMO gave, because even taking a very logical approach, you can see that the assumptions are not necessarily reliable. So we have looked at other jurisdictions, and we had looked, back in 2005, the NWMO, they did this study period, they called it, between 2002 and 2005, which was when they were studying the options and coming up with their recommendation of a deep geological repository. And during that period, they did not do one paper. They did not have one report that looked at dose. So that's when we looked at other jurisdictions, and there was a proposal for a deep geological repository in Nevada for all of the American high-level waste. And the state of Nevada was critical of this and had a team of experts working, and we have relied on the state of Nevada's assessment in some cases. So that state of Nevada, what they looked at, what their conclusions was that there would be increased level of radioactive radiation exposure due to the transportation. There will be 3 kinds. There will be routine exposure. It's a bystander dose. So it will be, we expect, for bystanders, somebody say 30 meters, living in a residence 30 meters from the route. That's the number that the state of Nevada used. Or other ways we can get bystander dose is when you're sitting in your car, parked next to that truck, going around the bypass in Thunder Bay or in North Bay, it can be a little slow. If you're stopped for construction, I come to the Northwest from the Northeast about 6 times a year, and at least half of those trips, there's a road closure, and every one of those trips, there's several stops for construction. Each of those instances, if you're in the vicinity of that truck, that increases your bystander dose, your dose by being in the vicinity. So radiation exposure, it's 3 things. It's dose, distance, and duration. So how much radiation is coming off of that package? The NWMO has some numbers. how far you are from that package, and how long you're beside or behind or in front of that package. Those three things are what give you your exposure estimate. And so as we drive the northern highways, we can see there are lots of reasons why that exposure could increase. But that's the routine transportation operations. The state of Nevada said that that is a cause for concern in terms of radiation exposures. And then there's also accidents, including severe accidents. One of the state of Nevada estimates was that it would be a severe accident would directly and I'm missing the word they use, but intensely, that wasn't the word, but intensely impact 622 square kilometers from a severe transportation accident. And then the other thing the state of Nevada recognized was terrorist attack during transportation, which I think it's something that we generally don't like to talk about, we don't like to think about, but we're in a period of a lot of upheaval internationally. And I think that sending, truck after truck after truck, carrying these kinds of radioactive loads, I think there is a legitimate concern around terrorist attack. So these are just, I'm going to just run through this. So this was a report the state of Nevada relied on that looked at what the dose would be from shipments. So depending on the number of ship truckments, distance from the route, maximally exposed individuals near highway routes could potentially receive annual doses equivalent to 2% to 266% of the average annual background dose. And the average annual background dose is something the industry often likes to say, well, it's less than the background dose. Well, it's the same as the background dose, but these doses are additive. We are already being subject to background dose, and that's from some natural occurring radioactive material, radon gas, but also weapons testing, nuclear operations, and so on. So there's causes, so the state of Nevada flagged these as causes for concern. Just a little bit about releases due to accidents. The state of Nevada, again, recognized 3 types of severe accidents. One of them studied fairly closely and identified that exposed individuals, the largest cause for impact would be primarily from inhalation of radionuclides. There have been a number of other, I'm going to just keep running through here because I want to get to questions. So this is another study done by the state of Nevada, Halsterd and Dilger, who did a review for us as well during a review for a different deep geological repository, that proposal has now collapsed. That was for low and intermediate level waste. But these are the radiological impacts. So again, routine exposure to people along the route, to transportation workers, and then as a result of accidents and as a result of terrorism impacts. And the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board, and I have this slide here mostly to remind me to say to you that in Canada we have a handicap, we have a deficit. In other jurisdictions, there are independent agencies. So the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board in the US does ongoing work looking at nuclear waste transportation concerns, potential impacts, safety concerns. And in Canada, I would say we do not have that. We have Natural Resources Canada, which promotes nuclear technology, and we have the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which licenses and permits nuclear facilities. When we're in hearings, and we do hearings around nuclear waste reactor relicensing and other nuclear projects, always our focus is on what's the waste that's going to be generated, how's it going to be managed in the long term. When we're in those hearings, what we observe is that Health Canada, Environment Canada, they defer to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, who generally defer to the industry. So it's a real deficit that we have in Canada around independent technical review of these projects and these technologies. So just the NWMO often likes to say, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, they have this narrative where they say, we have 1 million shipments of radioactive materials a year. Well, yeah, that includes every isotope going to your dentist's office for x-rays, and so yeah, so it's 1 million shipments, but those are of radioactive materials, not radioactive waste, and not high-level reactor fuel waste. But they have this narrative that we do this 1 million times a year, and there's never been an accident resulting in a radiological release or a death. So we have looked a little bit internationally. The US Department of Energy has done some reports that definitely did identify numerous accidents, numerous cases of releases, and there have been studies done in the Public Health England that identified accidents, injuries, and death, although that report was not specific on the details, and we're still trying to track that down. So I just want to touch briefly on some of the other risk populations that we're concerned about. A few years ago, we did a study with the Law Society of Ontario looking at first responders and how they're trained and how they're equipped to deal with radiological emergencies. And what we found was, we interviewed both city-based and volunteer-based first responders and fire departments. And in Northern Ontario, most of our coverage is provided by volunteer first responders, volunteer firefighters, in some cases volunteer EMS services. What we learned in doing this series of interviews and focus groups was that there's no training provided specific to radiological events. The trainings, the materials that are provided give minimal attention to radiological risk. And this Emergency Response Guide 2020 is the main kind of guidebook that the first responders refer to. And it, shockingly, in the 6 sections dealing with radioactive emergencies, says radiation presents minimal risk to transport workers, emergency response personnel, and the public during transportation accidents. Packaging durability increases as potential hazard of radioactive content increases. I consider that to be a problematic statement and misleading, and we have raised this particularly most recently with the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and Transport Canada, but have not yet seen any indication of a review or an improvement. So this is the kind of material that's in the guide, and I think it serves our first responders very poorly. The scenario basically is, so a truck is placarded, a transportation unit is placarded. So as an emergency response team would approach, they would see the placard, they might look to the guidebook for guidance, and that guidebook is going to tell them that there is minimal risk. And I think that is, I think that's deceptive. I'm going to look just quickly at the radiation protection regulations and talk about, in specific, what happens when there is an accident. So these are the dose limits. So you can see a member of the public who's not a nuclear energy worker, the allowable, the sort of the regulated dose limit is 1 millisievert. Now, there have been important and conclusive scientific studies, namely the biological effects of ionizing radiation report in 2005, Beer 7, that concluded that there is no threshold. There's no safe level of exposure to radiation. It doesn't mean every time you have an exposure that you're going to experience a direct or an attributable health effect. I've toured reactor stations, I've been on the uranium tailings. I don't assume that I don't expect that I'm going to have a direct health effect from that. But the reality is, I may. The reality is that we are all differently affected, that a woman is affected more than a man, just because of our physiology, that a younger person is affected more than an older person because of rate of cell production, and so on. But there is no safe level of exposure. There is no level of exposure for which there is not an associated risk. Again, it doesn't mean that you'll have a health effect that you can trace back, but it means there's no level of exposure without an associated risk. But the CNSC says 1 millisievert. That's the limit for exposures for member of the public. But a nuclear energy worker can be exposed to 50 millisieverts. So that is an occupational consequence for working in the industry. But then under emergency conditions, you can see that 50 goes much higher. And depending on the circumstance, and in an emergency situation, it's not clear how much information a first responder would have, who's making the call that says, oh, it's an emergency that's going to prevent conditions that could significantly affect people in the environment. Therefore, that emergency worker or that nuclear energy worker can be exposed to 5,000 millisieverts. Or is it just an action that might minimize dose consequence, in which case it's 1,000? I think that these levels of acceptance of exposure for nuclear energy workers, so those are our residents in Northern Ontario, if this facility was to be sited between Ignis and Dryden, those are our residents that are going to be accepting the levels of exposure as a nuclear energy worker. And in the case of an emergency response, those are our first responders potentially being faced with those kinds of exposures and associated consequence. So I'm almost done, but I just wanted to touch on the used fuel transportation package, which Dodie mentioned. And Dodie described them as being as NWMO, and I said create the impression. So the NWMO and the CNSC do create the impression that these used fuel package containers, the basket container, the used fuel package transportation package, have been subject to this test. Usually the way it goes is they say, particularly talking about the used fuel transportation package, because the basket case, the one Dodie talked about for the waste from out of Ontario, it's still a concept. It's not even designed. It's not even developed, or at last word from the NWMO. So it's a concept. So we're talking only about the used fuel transportation package. And generally the NWMO and Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, they say, there's this used fuel transportation package and it's been certified by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And it was. It was designed by Ontario Hydro during a different hearing that failed to get approval back in the 1980s. It was designed, 1980s, there was a hearing, and the CNSC certified that used fuel transportation package. But then the NWMO and CNSC, then they say, and there are these international safety tests that a package must be subject to. They don't generally say, but that certified package hasn't been subject to the safety tests. They create an impression and they lead us to come to the conclusion that they have been. But we've done an access to information request that took 2 years to get a response from. We got the first 600 pages initially, and what we learned in the first 600 pages was that our suspicions were well-founded, that in fact the used fuel transportation package had not been subject to full-scale testing, and it had not been subject to all 4 of those tests. In the 1980s, it was subject to a partial set of tests for the drop test for a half-scale model. So it wasn't the actual package. They didn't complete the tests. It was in the 1980s, and it was only the drop test, not the fire, not the immersion. So We have since got 6,000 pages, and I really had hoped to get through those 6,000 pages before I came tonight, so I could say, and in the next 6,000 pages, our thesis bore out. But I'll get back to you on that. But I think what is absolutely clear is that the packages have not been subject to the full suite of international safety tests that the NWMO implies they are. When I get through that 6,000 pages, I'll have a little bit more specific, a response on what actually they have done. But that's where our read on it is now. So the CNSC again says that it's been done over 45 years without a single radiological incident. So an incident is an accident. An incident is when there's some release of materials. So by the CNSC's own website, we see that there have been incidents, there have been accidents, a number of them. So 2018, a lot of them dealing with hauling yellowcake, uranium from Saskatchewan to the refinery in Blind River, but not all of them. So there have been a number of accidents involving Cameco shipments to Blind River, also shipments from Blind River to Port Hope, and also shipments from in Saskatchewan going to the going west. So 2 additional accidents had their origins in Canada but incurred in the US. And one of them was a truck caught fire. The driver unhooked the trailer and drove the truck ahead, which was absolutely great because it left the packages and the truck unaffected. Another one was in 2017, there was this other set of waste, liquid high-level waste that had to be returned from Chalk River to Savannah River because it had high levels of plutonium in it. So it, under this international agreement, it had to be returned. And that shipment arrived at Savannah River hot. So it was, there had been, there was surface contamination and high radiation, higher than accepted radiation readings from that package. So it is not accurate to say that there have been no incidents or accidents with radioactive materials, including waste, the Savannah River waste shipment. And there have been others reported internationally. So I think the CNSC figure was internationally. So then there's other reports that are released by Transport Canada which don't line up exactly with the CNSC numbers, but these are class 7 material is radioactive material, and so these are transport-related radiological emergencies that were reported by Transport Canada. 2019 there were 5, 2018 there were 5, 2017 there were 8, and so on. So I say all of this just to say that when the CNSC or the NWMO says, we ship all these things are being shipped, and there's never been an incident, there's never been an accident, by their own records, and it's difficult to access records, it's difficult to get the details on these, by their own publicly available information posted on their website, that is not true. So that is that part. Thank you for your attention.